Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to be joined by Shezad Dawood, whose work I've been lucky enough to see a couple of times over the last few years in various exhibitions and studio visits. And I'm really, really happy to be joined by him in person. Shehzad works across different disciplines: film, performance, painting. He uses materials like neon and sculpture and virtual reality to ask key questions of narrative, history, and embodiment. His practice often involves collaboration and knowledge exchanges, mapping across multiple audiences and communities, and through a fascination with esoteric otherness, the environment and architecture, both material and virtual. Shehzad interweaves stories, myths, realities, and symbolism to create richly layered artworks. He grew up in London and he lives and works there currently. He trained at St. Martin's and the Royal College of Art, and then he completed a PhD at Leeds Metropolitan University. And he's currently a senior research fellow at the University of Westminster, so that's quite a lot going on. He has fantastic solo exhibitions under his belt. Many of them happened last year: Blue Coat Liverpool, MoCA Toronto, Freeze Live. You were very busy in 2019, Shehzad. And the list sort of goes on and on. He also exhibited at the Venice Biennale, Timothy Taylor. He's been part of the Gwangju Biennale, the Sharjah Biennale of 2014. Oh, no, sorry, that's wrong. 2019. It was Sharjah Biennale 14. And he was also part of the Lahore Biennale, which just happened in 2020. Shehzad's work is in multiple very well-reputable collections across the world, including the Tate, LACMA in Los Angeles, the National Gallery of Canada, the US Government Art Collection, and the British Museum. And his films have screened globally, including the ICA in London and MoMA in New York. So that's quite the very extensive and extremely prestigious bio, Shehzad. How exciting.
God, that sounds very serious and a lot to live up to. And I'm just feeling like a scruffy guy in my studio in lockdown. But I'm under a challenge with my wife. I thought she'd be horrified when I didn't shave for a week, and she's now challenged me to see how long I can get it.
Ah, that's very clever. To see how long you can live with it. That's the best way of doing things. Just not criticize it, just let it be until you get bored.
She's a smarter woman than I am.
Yeah, she's very smart. Now, Shehzad, I thought we could start with your connections and exploration of South Asia. I mean, I know that you are of South Asian heritage and you've spent quite a lot of time in Karachi growing up. And I found that throughout your career, through a lot of your work, that sort of the threads of South Asia are woven through. And I was wondering whether you could chat to me a little bit about that. I know that it's quite prevalent in your recent work as well. Encroachments, which obviously premiered at the Sharjah Biennale in 2019. And I thought it'd be good to get a sense from you about what your fascination with the region is a little bit. I know that you found certain myths quite interesting that come out of Pakistan and India, and I thought you could chat a little bit about those.
Yeah, I mean, where to start? I mean, the Sharjah project really kind of was the sort of next chapter in a body of work I've been working on or exhibiting since 2010. In 2010, I did a show called Cities of the Future at Kimmel Prescott Road in Mumbai, which was based around, it was my own playful kind of imaginary of Corbusier and Chandigarh, almost imagining if the arch modernist was influenced by Tantra in his kind of meta vision for Chandigarh. And you know, for me, it was kind of quite a response. I remember being in college and you know, I always felt there was a more esoteric or inner dimension to Corb, and you know, tutors would say back then the kind of the given narrative was a very rationalist one, and I found that just sort of slightly kind of slightly untrue, and obviously so much scholarship has happened since. But I was very interested to take this idea of Corbusier and Tantra for a walk. And, you know, like with most of the things I do, I don't really know what I'm getting myself into. And, you know, that project led to another one where I was fascinated from time spent in Pondicherry with Antonin and Noemi Raymond's project for the Sri Aurobindo Ashram dormitory called Golconde. And that became a sort of, it just sort of suggested itself as the natural follow-up to the Corbusier investigation. Because if Chandigarh is such an iconic symbol of kind of Western modernism kind of rearing its head and being transformed through South Asia, then the Raymond's project was a much quieter, much more kind of integrated project and integrated within the community. So basically, Raymond was a sort of Czech-born American architect who worked with Frank Lloyd Wright on the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, and infamously had a falling out with Lloyd Wright, basically because he questioned Lloyd Wright's total lack of engagement with Japanese history, culture, and architecture, and he was sort of trying to sort of push Lloyd Wright towards a more integrated architecture rather than a sort of top-down imposition. And it took me years of research. I love going down rabbit holes with my research. That's almost the most fun part of what I do. And it took me years, and I finally found a stat of the letter that Frank Lloyd Wright addressed to Antonin Raymond, basically saying, "You'll never work in this town again."
Wow.
And Raymond and his wife, the only commission they could get, because they were pretty much blacklisted by Frank Lloyd Wright, was this ashram dormitory, which was which was on a small budget. And the ashram devotees and other local workers helped build it. So you've got these wonderful images of sort of bamboo ladders and, just people in, very impractical ashram attire trying to get up bamboo ladders with cement. And it's, and yet it's one of the most poetically beautiful buildings I can think of. Raymond pioneered a use of kind of a louvered shutter, so there's no fans, no air conditioning, but there's a sort of transverse cooling system just through the circulation of air in these shutters. And there's a real sense of sort of negative and positive space that really is so of a piece with Indian philosophy, but also the Japanese culture that he was so enamored of. And it's interesting, you can see how his later projects in India and Japan become, these influences get, in a way, he almost gets transformed through influence.
And how respectful to do that as well, to really think about the space that you're in, the surroundings, the people who are going to be visiting those buildings on a daily basis, and create something especially for them.
I think, it's any kind of practice. You have to allow yourself to be transformed by your subject in order to be actually respectful of it. It's not enough to be, just to kind of put it on a pedestal. You actually have to be transmuted by it. And maybe that's my sort of, more hokey, esoteric aspect of being an artist. But, I think there's something, in a way, I love to kind of be the kind of split personality. Half is kind of, very kind of about research and discovery. And then the other half is letting it become something else. Because otherwise, if it's just illustrative, it's not actually transformative for you or for the viewer.
Exactly. And I think there has to be more to it than just what you see initially. There has to be layers of research and thinking. That those are the kind of projects that I think engulf the viewer as well as the artist, because especially with you, the kind of projects that you do end up taking years and years of research and work towards them until they sort of mutate into the form that you're happy with, right?
Yeah, in a way, it's like you said when we first started talking, that like you did a lot in 2019, but in a way, it's a sort of, some years are just accidentally busy because things that have been a decade in development suddenly, come to fruition weirdly, in that weird way in which, no bus comes and then they all come along at once.
Exactly. And tell me more about the project then in Sharjah, which then also translated itself into being at the Lahore Biennale.
So in a way, after I did the Raymonds in Pondicherry, the next project, which was actually the most personal one because it sort of returned to Karachi, was Encroachments, that was initially at Sharjah, was co-commissioned very generously by Sharjah and New Art Exchange in Nottingham, with some extra generous support by the Bagri Foundation. So a lot of my projects become long-winded because it takes a while to raise the money to do them, because there's a lot of kind of R&D, both me traveling, less so at the moment, and also just sometimes technically, and I'm often finding the form a project needs to take through the research. So for example, I hadn't brought VR into the Corbusier or the Raymond project, but it was absolutely kind of pivotal to Encroachments. Just because I guess in a way it became the next sort of modernist architect. I was looking at Richard Neutra's proposed embassy for Karachi, which became a consulate after Pakistan moved the capital to Islamabad halfway through the construction phase.
Okay.
So it's this, for me, it was always this kind of almost larger metaphor for US-Pakistan relations over the years, the fate of this building, it just seemed to be like the ships crossing in the night paradigms between the two countries. But then it also had a very personal resonance for me because I used to, and maybe there's people listening in, but as a kid in Karachi, I used to go to the American Center, which you went round. You didn't go through the main entrance to the consulate in Karachi, the Neutra building. The main entrance was for visa and consular services, and around the side was the American Center, which was like, like I suppose a lot of like the Goethe Institute. Lots of people have these sort of cultural, cultural/propaganda wings to their presence, particularly in the third world. And the American Center was where I would go, being kind of grassing myself up. I would go there totally uncritically to read Archie comics and eat Hostess Twinkies, which seemed like these kind of rare objects of desire.
Yeah.
Hostess, because you'd read about the Hostess. I don't know if people read comics in that period, but the Hostess Twinkies adverts would be in the inside cover of the Archie comic, and it was this kind of, sitting in Karachi, you'd think, wow, this is kind of, this is what I'd like to get to in life, Hostess Twinkie.
This is what American culture is. That's what you end up thinking at the time, right?
Yeah, and then it changes, and then it comes back to that, I mean, in the present, it really looks like Hostess Twinkies are back in vogue. In terms
so
of
do you want to walk us a little bit through how the VR turned out? I find that quite fascinating. What do viewers see when they put on the sort of VR set?
Well, interestingly, if the Neutra building became the sort of centerpiece, I then went sort of to other points in time that it kind of made me think of. I've always been fascinated with Feroz Sons, the old Feroz Sons in Lahore on Mall Road. Just because whenever I'd go there, I love the floor. I'm really interested in this idea about where buildings and architecture becomes visceral. It impacts your memory through feeling rather than through a sort of rational formulation. And Feroz Sons, I don't know, again, if anybody on the call knows what I'm talking about, that's wonderful. But I think there's something about it. Whenever I'd go there, the floor fascinated me. So
what was the floor like?
So the floor, I think by the time they shut in 2017, I think there must have been about at least 12 floors, if not 15.
Wow.
Because they'd filled it in in different areas. So as one bit through a flood or this, or when the fire happened, different areas would be repaired, but they'd only do it partially. So it became this sort of jigsaw puzzle of time, beneath your feet. And I think sometimes it's those things that we can miss, like the floor beneath our feet, the ground beneath our feet, that we
becoming into an archive.
It's an archive. It's it's a space of memory. And that was starting to excite me, as well with there was a sort of then a relationship between that space and the consulate. Also, there was in the Neutra consulate during the Cold War, there was a whole section that was sort of not on any maps and didn't show up on radar. And it was where the CIA had their supercomputer during the Soviet-Afghan conflict. And, obviously I didn't know any of that as a kid. I was, but but I started to relate it to other spaces, that idea of the CIA supercomputer. There's a backdrop, there's a Cold War politics here, there's a post-colonial politics going on. So for example, my other main memory of my childhood in Karachi was video game arcades. So in the 80s, we all were crazy. And, when a new game would come out, we'd just be begging, borrowing, stealing change to go and get tokens and play Space Invaders or Defender. And, again, like with the comics, I didn't see the propaganda function till much later. And even still, people are only now starting to examine the propaganda function of 80s video games. And if you think about it, it was the Reagan era. It was in the time of the Soviet-Afghan conflict. Zia ul-Haq was power. And, the Cold War was in full escalation,
In
and
full swing, yeah.
if you think about it, what's Space Invaders, Defender, they're all about territorial sovereignty and integrity, which was being marketed by the US to third world developing nations as a buffer against Soviet communism and the encroachments they represented. So, you know, in a way, it wasn't just through the American center, but through the video game arcades. I think a lot of us were sort of unconscious sort of stooges for sort of US propaganda. You know, it's how
I love how this time period of your youth, your childhood, when you were sort of exploring American traditions, was what you went right back to when you were thinking about this film, not film, sorry, but this project of encroachment. So these different childhood memories are really what you looked at, and those are what fed into it.
Yeah. And I mean, those video game arcades had a floor as well. So they had this sort of cheap terrazzo flooring, you know, chips as it's known, that was, that's, you know, became really popular. A lot of people don't know that that was developed in Pakistan for cheap, to try and be a kind, to undercut the Italian version and as an export product. But it didn't match up on quality terms. So it ended up being used for domestic consumption. And, you know, in the 1950s, it was, you know, still sort of as desirable. So the consulate, Neutra's consulate, is all, you know, 50s, 60s Pakistani, you know, chips terrazzo. And then in by the time in the 80s, you know, with the sort of downgrade of it as a product, it's filling the floors of all these video game arcades that are literally pop-up spaces in disused commercial space. It's like, it's grassroots entrepreneurialism. You know, some guy rents a few machines, puts the power cable in, and puts a cash box on the table, a portrait of Jinnah on the wall, and, you know, he's got a business.
And gets a load of young kids coming in, yeah.
Yeah, so it's all these kind of social, cultural affects that become really interesting for me. And, you know, this flooring, obviously, like the flooring at Feroz Sons, becomes a visceral marker of history. So, and also, you know, of personal tragedy, because every time I would die in Space Invaders, the shame, you know, next to your peers, and that you'd maybe run out of your change for the day and you'd have to go home, you'd look down with your tail between your legs and you'd look down at this terrazzo floor. So this terrazzo flooring, you know, like its failure as an export product, was also, you know, this personal bereavement every time I ran out of change.
It's a link for you, really.
Yeah. So and I was very interested in this link by which the personal becomes the political, becomes the spatial. And that suddenly was just like, this has to be virtual reality, because one of the things about virtual reality that goes beyond film is this idea that you're in it. You know, you're in it in 3 dimensions. So could I, and the challenge became to myself, could I actually recreate these spaces with some of that visceral emotional pull?
So really putting the viewer into your memory, in a sense, into you as a young youth in these spaces, as well as you were exploring the embassy, you're exploring the arcades, and also the Feroz Sons bookstore. Yeah. What a treat for them.
I brought it up to the present as well. So the last scene, you come to a kind of contemporary encroachment. And obviously, part of the reason for the title was to retake, you know, because there's such a sort of negative press for encroachments in the Pakistani press, you know, where, you know, the poorest just, again, like with video game arcades, being quite entrepreneurial and just building onto private or public land and making things happen. Making cafes, making chaiwalas, making, you know, kebabwalas.
No, and I think Karachi and Lahore both went through a stage where they started just removing these encroachments in the stalls from various, and people were very upset because they've been there for such a long time, decades, I think, at this point, and they add to the culture of the city.
Exactly, and they were bulldozing them, and it became quite a groundswell of, you know, negative opinion whipped up in the press. And yet, you know, I was interested in how they sort of contest this boundary between public and private space, and what that means, and who is it for. And, you know, that sort of critique I thought was really important to bring to bear, and was missing from a discussion of encroachments, you know, in Pakistan. So I wanted to kind of play with that. So the final scene you come to is a chaiwala in Landi. And, you know, and I spent a whole lot of time at this chaiwala, literally videoing and photographing every detail of the tiles on the wall and the mismatched tiles. So the mismatched tiles there became like the mismatched floor in Feroz Sons. This trace moved through these different decades, you know, from the 50s to the present. And it became a sort of a way to kind of chart a kind of shifting terrain of the country and its relationship to itself. So actually the final piece of the puzzle in the whole VR is the soundtrack. So a lot of people get caught up in the architecture and the visuals, but the whole soundtrack was a whole other sort of body of research which was into the whole beat band movement, which was largely in Karachi, but existed to a degree in Lahore. But in the late 60s, early 70s, you know, when you had swinging Karachi and you had girls in hot pants and, you know, and people dancing till dawn, like the Metropole Hotel was the scene. And, you know, you had the house band there with the Forethoughts. And, you know, literally, the drummer of the Forethoughts is now a good friend of mine. Oh. That's also what's really important to my process. It's making friends. It's not just treating somebody as a research subject, but it's actually developing a relationship. And, you know, Es and Sajjad of the Panthers, who were like, the Forethoughts and the Panthers were really the two biggest bands of the day. And interestingly, I'm friends with both the drummers. Maybe I have, you know,
maybe you have an affinity with drummers, but that's really cool that you were able to really go back, figure out who was popular at the time, who had an influence on you really, and have them collaborate and be part of this larger project. What was the reception like to it? Did people sort of go back in time as well along with you and remember the floor, remember the chai wala's mismatched towel, which I guess is more recent? But
I mean, there was an older gentleman from Quetta at Sharjah.
Okay.
And he actually, you know, broke down in tears after doing the VR with me. Oh. You know, and I like to sort of, you know, I don't like to be standoffish and hide out. I like to hang out and kind of meet people. Yeah. It's kind of just, you know, I think, you know, they always say don't fight who you are. So, you know, I just tend to be that person who likes to sort of hang out and see who turns up and have a chat. You know?
And it's fun to see how people respond to the work you've put out there. It's your baby, it's your creation. I think it's completely fair to want to see how people deal with it or explore it in their own way. I'm sure that also lends itself well to the larger research project behind it.
It does. And then also you open yourself up to sort of serendipity and yeah. You know, and it was just amazing, like while obviously in Sharjah, having these amazing experiences with people, you know, and, you know, and actually I took Nalini Malani through it. And she was just like, because she'd grown up in Karachi before partition.
I didn't realize that. Wow.
So it brought back all sorts of memories for her. And so, you know, I'm getting goosebumps even recounting these stories because they're so, you know, they add to the visceral emotion attached to the whole reason for what I do, you know.
Definitely.
And, you know, just to say, I guess, you know, and then that, so Hur Al-Qasimi, you know, while I was there in Sharjah installing, she said, can we go for coffee and have a chat? And she invited me to show it in Lahore. And that was like, oh, thank God, you know, because it was...
Yeah, good way to bring it back.
Well, I'm a softie like that. Like, I think there's something almost, there's an ethical imperative to return a project to whence it came. And if you know, if place has given you so much, you have to return.
You have to go back. And how was it to install it in the Park Tea House? I mean, that's also a location that has so much history for literature, for writers and philosophers. They all gather there. I went and saw your installation, actually. I was really lucky to be able to do so. And I loved how regular people were just sort of at the restaurant and eating and drinking chai and kind of immersed in your work. Some of them were ignoring it. Some of them were noticing it. And it was really special to see it like that.
I mean,
how did you feel?
I'm always, I mean, I love all the people I work with and the shows that I do, but there's always a special place in my heart for site specificity. Yeah. And, you know, I remember Hur got in touch with a few possible locations for my work. And you know, I'm normally kind of a bit more polite than that, but I sort of demanded Pak Tea House.
Good for you.
It was just like a dream come true. You know, it was, you know, it's on Mall Road, so Feroz Sons is up the road. A lot of the authors, you know, for those who don't know, Pak Tea House was the literary salon of Pakistan after partition. And a lot of the authors who would be in there smoking, shouting, arguing, you know, were then trying to get their books published up the street. So it started to become this map of the city. and that relationship.
Another
And
archive.
another archive. And if you go, you know, up the road from Pack Tea House, there's one day of the week, there's a secondhand book market along there. So a lot of the
Okay.
books that I kind of, I think of, you know, kind of from my trips are, you know, even though Feroz San's, the original book, I mean, the original book, there are other shops are still going, but the original bookshop is closed. But also there's a sort of, there's various high points for me of book cover graphic design in Pakistan that that are fantastic. I mean, you know, there's such a resource and another archive in themselves. And you know, I must say a shout out to Iftikhar Dadi, who really helped me kind of track down various archives of pretty much everything that came out of Feroz San's.
He's such an ocean of knowledge. It's amazing.
He is, you know, he is just a gem and a very generous, kind man.
Very, very generous. Yeah.
So he really helped me sort of really track down this sort of this archive, because I love to kind of make an archive my own. And then, you know, for Pack Tea House in Lahore, it was critical to me that it was functioning as the tea house. I didn't want it to be this anodyne art space. I wanted it to be exactly what you said, that people would be, and it was amazing kind of installing it, because I had, you know, I was in my element. I was having like 20 to 50 conversations a day.
Yeah.
You know, and with non-art, you know, with some art audiences, but 90% non-art audiences who were using that space. And, you know, there were literary groups that I didn't know were still going, you know, that I'd read about historically. And then suddenly they were coming in going, what the hell do you think you're doing? Because it's their territory. And I'd be I'd have to say, be slightly like in awe that you guys still exist, and then sort of explain what I was doing there and excuse myself for stepping on their turf. And that was, you know, I think that is the space for negotiation for an artist. You know, it's how do you really speak wider and into kind of into the public sphere? It's
how
really
to weave your way in, essentially.
And well, you're weaving, you know, you're weaving with the subject matter of people's histories, lives. So you have to speak to them.
Exactly. How did they respond then when you explained what the project was? Were they quite intrigued by it?
I mean, you know, the range of conversations, like literally this one, you know, writers group were pretty aggressive until we became friends. And then I was invited to join their very kind of aggressive kind of monthly meeting.
How cool. And I'm sure it's quite exclusive, the membership of that. They wouldn't have just asked anybody.
And they were worried I was some sort of spy or stooge going to report on them to the authorities. So, you know, it's amazing that the space still has that energy and that vitality. But also I spoke to people from so many generations and people who just stumbled in because they'd heard about some sort of Biennale thing going on, and, you know, and they weren't sure if this was a venue or they just could get a kebab
cup of tea.
Yeah. And I ended up just having tea with the most broad range of people, which, you know, that puts a big smile on my face.
That's honestly one of the most special things about doing an exhibition and kind of being there on the ground, having people come in and interact with the work. And even if they don't interact with it, just chatting to them and listening about to their point of view, their days. I don't know, that must have been so fascinating. But also I wanted to ask you, for this work as well, it was a great example of your larger practice because you did draw in a lot of different mediums. It wasn't just the VR installation. You also had, from what I remember, and correct me if I make a mistake, but you had your sort of tapestries as well. You had the wallpapered walls of the Park Tea House with the imagery of the flooring that you mentioned earlier. And you also had, I mean, quite a lot going on. I find it quite cool how you bring in each of those mediums almost. And if your neons were also there, each of your mediums into the projects that you take on, is this quite a conscious decision, or is it whatever works for the piece that you're creating? Is it more fluid?
It's pretty conscious. It's ultra conscious, if I'm honest. I'm a bit OCD in terms of, I really think, like, you know, exhibition design is something I get obsessive about. You know, I'm very collaborative, and I'll happily work with curators and museum directors on it. But I think it's something you really have to take seriously and invest in, because why the hell should anybody step out of their daily life and engage with what you're doing if you haven't put in the time and
Thought
effort.
about it. Yeah.
So, and I think you're misremembering different versions of encroachments.
Sorry.
House. No, it's great. I mean, that's actually me doing my job, because if you're confusing what you've seen in one space with another, it's starting to, for me, it goes back to the reality principle. You know, I make art because I'm interested to kind of deconstruct reality. I'm not interested to represent. So how do I do that? How do you play with times, with different time periods? Because then you're playing with past, present, future. So you're destabilizing the ground on which people walk. So all the more reason you've got to be kind in how you kind of hold their hand doing it. So at Pack Tea House, there was this very subtle wallpaper strip, which in Sharjah covered whole rooms. Whereas in Pack Tea House, it was this thin strip around the sort of the walls of the upper floor. So actually, you know, I wonder how many people went looking for my work and went to the ground floor of Pack Tea House and didn't go upstairs and thought, oh, I missed it. You know?
That's almost what happened to me, actually. And then I remember we asked, and they're like, no, there's lots more upstairs. So they sent us upstairs as well. So we did have a look around there. And I actually really liked how subtle it was in many ways as well, because you couldn't quite tell whether it was one of your installations or whether it was just the general,
well, interestingly, the
wallpaper.
The wallpaper strip, the manager of Pack Tea House loved it, so I left it. It's gifted.
Oh, good. How special.
You know, wallpaper was, you know, I love designing wallpapers because it's such an interesting way to kind of recontextualize a space. And as you say, the wallpaper I designed there, that's also been at the version of Encroachments in Nottingham as well, is based on these terrazzo patterns that had such an impact on me. But I've replayed them digitally, so they become this sort of, you know, almost futuristic version of what I knew as a kid. And, you know, and then also remember that's the floor, and then I'm sticking it on the wall. So you're already gently messing with people's, you know, dimensions before you even take them into VR. So there's this subtle strip of what should be on the floor around a wall. And on it, I placed these little paintings that I did, which were unique to the Lahore presentation, of my 10 favorite Urdu book cover designs of the whole 20th century. So they also reflect a kind of changing set of decades and politics and cultural tropes, just in the way the designs change.
And what's wonderful is then each presentation of the project becomes extremely unique and very, very sort of unique to that space and extremely site specific.
Yeah, I mean, there's things that repeat, but I think you always have to address, I guess as somebody who's a bit obsessed with architecture, I feel like it's a basic requirement of you as an artist to kind of address each architecture you step into.
Make space and change it around. Makes complete sense. Amrita Javeri just has a question. Amrita, we put some images as a post earlier, and I can ask Shezad and his studio to share images of the wallpaper of Pack Tea House as well. So we'll put pictures of that as well. But yeah, images of his work are available as a post. I also wanted to now ask, and we have enough time, so that is good, about this other mammoth project that you've been working on for the last so many years called Leviathan. Now, Shezad is also a filmmaker as part of his artistic repertoire, and this is a pretty great 10-episodic film, is that correct?
If I get to the end of it, we finished five of the 10.
Well done. In what, just like 3 years, right? Because it premiered at Venice with in 2015. Oh, sorry, 5 years. In 2015 with the first 2 episodes, correct?
17, Zahra.
2017, yeah, with the first 2 episodes.
So, yeah.
And can you tell a little bit about that project?
Well, I guess, you know, in a way, I like to be both and. So whereas, you know, I'm very interested in these sort of politics of South Asia and how the modernist period leads into the present. You know, I'm also kind of interested in a sort of more global idea of ecology, oceans, migration, you know, which obviously we're all subject to those forces. Never more, you know, that's never been more revealed than in the present moment.
Yeah, so timely.
Well, you know, you don't wish to be timely, especially with a subject like that. You know, I wish I was just sort of, you know, a dystopian fantasist. But the whole Leviathan project started probably in 2014 or 2015, like you were saying, you know, these bigger projects just take, well, they take time
Years, yeah.
to do them justice and to kind of, and to find the right forms to kind of express them. So actually, weirdly, the whole Leviathan project, I also write just to kind of, you know, keep myself busy and off the streets. So I was asked to write a critical piece on democracy a number of years back, and I failed to deliver it because I got so confused about what my position was on a history of democracy and its institutions that I would, you know, be a Marxist at breakfast and a fascist by dinner time. So, you know, I started to think about how you could reflect the kind of the emerging sort of schizophrenia of democratic participation, etc. You know, so it's like, what do you do with this? And then I was separately doing a lot of research on the oceans, and particularly on, you know, on shifting physiological factors in the oceans linked to climate. And then I realized, because I, you know, researching democracy, I'd been reading a lot of Hobbes, Jonathan Swift, and it, you know, there were all these fishy metaphors, for want of a better word, in the kind of history of in a history of political thought. And it just seemed like the two projects were one and the same. And that was really galvanized, you know, in 2015, when you had all these media images of refugees and migrants traveling by sea, and what it meant, not just this idea of borders that became an easy flashpoint, but I think citizenship, you know, belonging, species, you know, where does one thing begin and another thing end? And I think what really did it for me was a marine engineer I ended up speaking to. I mean, I'm lucky enough that I meet so many, well, I go and seek them out. I go and bug people a lot. And then
And for this project, you have a lot of collaborators, and you've been speaking to tons and tons of scientists, right? To sort of filter in the information.
You know, a lot of people have very generously given their time. I mean, all the films really revolve around a kind of a fictional, imaginary journey through the world 20 to 50 years from now. And each of the 10 episodes will be, the ones complete already are, and hopefully the rest will be completed, but each one is narrated by a different character. So in a way, it helped me resolve the kind of schizophrenia of my attempted riposte to democracy.
Article.
Yeah. It was like, okay, I can just sort of put all my sort of contradictory thought forms into the mouths of different characters, exploring this world of the future, but how to make this world somewhat believable. So a lot of kind of oceanographers, marine biologists, migrant rights activists, political scientists have fed in and shared with me their sort of speculative models of the future, and where a lot of these issues might end up.
And you've also accumulated the research and put it onto a separate website, right? So more people can access the information from the marine biologists.
It's a bit of a mainstay of my practice, is that, you know, there is a really strong collaborative element in how to manifest that. So with Leviathan, there was just so many people giving their time and research, you know, to this crazy artist sort of, you know, trying to imagine the future through some sort of schizophrenic journey through the globe in 20 to 50 years, that it became important to kind of bring them back. So already in Venice, we had a kind of quite a large public program where we had, you know, various people who'd spoken to the project come and speak to the public directly. So it wasn't just about me as the intermediary. It was, you know, kind of revealing some of the skeleton behind the project.
Interesting. And tell me, you were mentioning characters for each of the episodes. What are the characters based on? Are they based upon the individuals who gave you the information, or is it just a sort of someone from a different country? Or
it's a mishmash of people from different countries. I wanted to kind of almost, you know, and the projects continually evolve. So in a way, the writing, you know, my Elizabeth, who, you know, has been working on it, or, you know, I can sometimes deliver her a script 2 days before we're shooting, and she has to translate it into Eritrean, you know. So it's because I will have met somebody 2 days before who gave me a new insight. So it's really been about trying to kind of factor in an array of voices. Because how do we collectively imagine our future? Because if we can't imagine where it might go to and how bad it might get, can't really change course. You know, it's only by it becomes about immersions through other means. So in a way, it doesn't have to. I remember, like, when I did the project at Freeze last year, somebody came up to me and was a bit disappointed it wasn't VR, and I said it's all VR. You know, it's all VR. In a way, it's all about immersion for me. It's about taking people into a space, whether that's through exhibition design, whether it's through a narrative that becomes sort of all-consuming. It's thinking about how to go on a journey, and also how to go on a journey together. So in a way, you know, if I share my references, my research, it's not me imposing a view on you. It's kind of let's have a conversation. Again, that's how I feel about my audience.
Is there any episode that you really think scared you, or is a story that stayed with you?
Yeah, there's
Speaking to all
terrible
of these
ones.
different individuals, yeah.
I mean, it's some of my darkest work. You know, in some ways, if, like, you know, my work's, you know, always got a certain amount of politics and social engagement in it, but Leviathan has taken me to some dark places. Also, just because sometimes meeting environmentalists, and they'll, you know, obviously not on the record, and but off the records, they'll say some stuff, and you'll be like, oh God, that's really bad. You know, you actually think, really scary, should I have had children? You know, it's, and then it's like, oh shit, what do we do? You know, we don't. If this becomes, you know, it becomes a burden, it becomes a responsibility, and it goes back into the project. It's like, how do I communicate this information? How do I share it? How do we avoid this path, you know, that we seem to be on? How do we think through it?
Do you think as an artist that your methods of conveying the same information are somehow maybe reaching a different audience, a wider audience, or perhaps are you able to break down all of that information that you've heard and create something that people are able to understand, or perhaps believe, in a sense? Because I feel as though we keep reading articles, and until this present moment, before this, we kept reading articles about how difficult the world was becoming, how people were not taking care of the environment, how governments and policymakers really needed to act, but nothing really was happening. And I wonder whether watching the episodic series Leviathan, it's somehow, because it's coming from an entirely different source, that of an artist, and because it's so immersive, do you think it perhaps has a different kind of impact that might be stronger?
Well, I think it has a visceral impact. You know, like episodes 3 and 5 actually terrify me. I can't believe I wrote those.
Really?
Yeah,
wow.
they're harsh. But equally, you know, like I'm working on 6 through 10, and my idea was always that 1 to 5 was the dystopic arc, and 6 to 10 was the kind of redemptive, but not an easy kind of fix. It's difficult. It's a difficult uphill climb to think about methodologies for surviving the future that we might be heading towards. So, you know, I think there's, yeah. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but.
No, but it does, in a sense. Pretty heavy things, though.
Yeah, and I guess maybe there's a way that, you know, like the visceral floor of Thoreau's Sons, finding a visceral route allows a different window onto these subjects. You know, I'm not going to pretend. So. I'm not going to pretend I'm going to change climate deniers, you know, feelings. But equally, even a lot of politicians who are very firmly in agreement with climate science and would like to see more done about it are stuck in caught in a difficult position between their beliefs and representing their constituents who are concerned about their jobs in, say, the oil and gas industry, etc. So I think, how do we start to become more grown up in the political sphere and start to talk about a managed transition? You know, because none of the targets at the moment are gonna add up. You know, we need to go further and faster, but we can't keep brushing it under the carpet as climate, you know, as, oh, we're working on this and we're setting targets that, you know, where we can avoid meeting, or that even if we meet them, they're not quite good enough. I think it needs to be talked about in a more transparent fashion. And you know, the day, I'm not overly optimistic about how many people I can reach, or, you know, what audiences I might reach, but you know, I think you've got to do something. In a way, the whole project, the whole project is me kind of, you know, trying to do within my sort of limited capacity as an artist something to justify justify my existence to my children when they grow up.
To be honest, that's all you really can do at this point anyway. But tell me, how did people respond to it? And you had mentioned to me earlier that you've been extremely busy with new projects that are coming up. So I was wondering whether you wanted to talk a little bit about those before we opened up for questions.
Well, I mean, it's been, like a moment ago when I said, I was, you know, rather than being pleased about, being on topic, I'm kind of horrified because I would have rather avoided,
Yeah.
the current, a lot of the, and I don't just mean the current COVID situation, but I think even before that, we were, seeing, you know, um, yeah, a climate emergency. I think it goes beyond that. It's a sort of existential crisis of us as a
Mm-hmm.
species, how we wish to see ourselves, and what am I working on now? It's almost this same slight sort of, I feel almost guilty because people are getting in touch with me loads because of my work on climate and the digital, which suddenly seem to be super relevant in the time of Corona. And it's like, Jesus, why couldn't we get to this stuff without it getting this bad? What is wrong with us? What is wrong with us as a species? This innate sort of selfishness that I feel, how do we shift that?
It's easier to ignore the problem until it completely overtakes you, and then suddenly we're like, uh-oh, now what do we do? So that's probably what's going on as well. Now that it's really staring everybody in the face is when they're thinking, well, now it's really time to make a change. And
Yeah.
again, I think what you said earlier about political leaders having to step forward is very, very true. At the end of the day, even your other projects were very much about political movements in the background. I think that's obviously what's happening here and now as well.
Let's see. There's a lot of buffoons in charge at the moment.
Yeah, what do you do? And so what else is keeping you busy? Do you know what's in the pipeline for the next couple of years or?
Well, I was supposed to be filming episode 7 of Leviathan
Oh,
in
yes.
Senegal last month, and so it's been very interesting keeping up with some contacts there, through these kind of channels. So, speaking to ecobiologists, anthropologists over the phone. There's a sort of sadness about not being on the ground with them.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also a sort of, a kind of, it's quite nice not to be traveling because there's also a kind of innate hypocrisy with, traveling places to kind of try and work on the climate. There's an
Yeah,
essential contradiction in that,
that's
which
true.
I don't hide from. I just hope that the work I'm doing somehow just about justifies some of the journeys I've been taking to make it happen.
And maybe now that you're able to make it work in this period of quiet with you not being there physically, you can think about different methods of having it move on.
Absolutely. And I think in that way, it's a good wake up for all of us to think about exactly that, methodologies and how we can start to repurpose how we do things. I mean, I think there's a lot of optimism about how we might emerge from this current situation into something better, more conscious, more present.
Yeah, let's hope
But let's
so.
see. There's been many things in the past where we've hoped for such changes and they haven't happened. I think it requires a consciousness shift.
No, it does indeed. So let's take a look at some of the questions. I find this one quite interesting. Majid is asking, Shezad, can you share any science fiction references you use in your work? And I know that you're quite inspired by science fiction, so I was quite happy to see this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably two of the biggest influences on my thinking from science fiction are Ursula Le Guin
Mm.
and Octavia Butler, who are both just really amazing humanists and yet can speak to what goes beyond the human. So I think, they're two real old favorites of mine, but who continue to kind of, influence and inspire me.
Very cool. And how have you drawn their writings or readings into your work? Any
Well,
particular instances, or is it
well, if
more
you
of the
think about,
general?
well, Octavia Butler and her like Seed to Harvest talks about whole generations of shifting from,
Mm.
from slavery to beyond it, through these kind of creatures or beings who kind of exist over time. And so there's this sort of sense of kind of exhaustion and struggle, and which seems to kind of, for me, reflect what it is that, what it is to be human. And like that sort of structural basis for her fiction has been a big influence on how I've looked at Leviathan, and how I've attempted to kind of, walk in her shadow.
Makes sense. Does anybody have any other questions for Shezad? Otherwise, I think we're ready to say goodbye, because I'm always very conscious of how Instagram cuts you off in an hour, and it's never fun when that happens. No? Okay, well, Shezad, thank you so much for this. I've had the most enjoyable conversation with you. Thank you for taking out an entire hour of your time to chat to us. Thank you, everybody who tuned in. I'm so grateful that you were able to take our time on a Thursday. I'm sorry the days keep changing. I'm really trying to go out of my way to find one that suits everybody, but artists also have busy schedules. So what do you do?
Well, thank you. That was a fun conversation, and it's been
you.
great to see so many friends tuning in, and
Yes,
to everyone who's tuned in. Thank you very much.
thank you. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.